Okay, so just let me go back to the main point here, which is to really thank Ali for for the amount of work that she has put into this conference. I'm really thrilled to be here, and I am really excited about a day in which I'm sure I'm going to learn a lot, because as you will discover very quickly, my knowledge of the world ends around the Industrial Revolution. So it is really thrilling to be here. So just to give you a little bit of context here, I am going to plunge this conversation about assemblies and lotteries into a sort of a broader historical context here, looking at what I will sort of like define in a moment as instances of historical collective governance. And so here I don't really have, let me just begin with a shout out to my collaborators without whom this project would never have existed, including Nathan Schneider at the University of Colorado and one of our postgraduate RAs, Riley Wong, who's done a bunch of the analysis that I will present today, and a bunch of RAs at King's, where I work. In this context, in this room, I don't have to articulate so much the sort of like a motivating question behind the project, which is, of course, something along the lines of what Ali has already articulated. It's not so much per se the sort of like a collapse of liberal democracy, although that is certainly behind the scenes. It is also just the sheer surge in demand in spaces for participation, something that I, as a historian, particularly a historian of classical Athens, have sort of like grown up studying, but it is certainly not something that, at least until like 10 years ago, so to speak, really permeated the work of politics. And we could, Ali has already shown some evidence of the sort of like the steepness of this surge, but also the variety of instances in which we see sort of like forms of participation, sort of like a pop-up in modern politics, online and offline, things like political parties, redistricting citizen permanent institutions like redistricting commissions, and of course the climate assemblies that have taken up so much of the sort of like newspaper front pages in these in recent years. So the sort of like a motivating question for a historian like me, or someone trained in history like me, is that we sort of like fret a lot about these modern experiments with participatory governance. But of course, participatory governance is not a 21st century phenomenon. It is something that is certainly aided by technology, but that did not begin in 1990 or 1970. And so the problem, though, is that once you start looking into collective governance in an historical perspective, what you get is a pretty sort of like a strange story. And the story begins with the sort of like a suitability for humans to live in small bands of hunter-gatherers, where horizontal governance was easy, of course, for a variety of reasons, homogeneous preferences, small scale, and so on and so forth. And then we see sort of like a large-scale collective governance experiments pop up throughout history, but in a particular part of the world, right? So this is, of course, classical Athens and Republican Rome, sort of the 17th century and onward experiences of early modern Europe. But of course, collective governance in historical perspective is not a European phenomenon, as this story, this very influential story, seems to suggest. We have plenty of evidence of collective governance outside of Europe from various disciplines, archaeology, anthropology, some political science, but this evidence is really not systematized. And so the result, I believe, is that we don't really have a clear view of under what conditions collective governance arises, survives, or sort of flourishes, and when and under what conditions it fails. So the project that I'm going to be describing a little bit today, before I delve more specifically into the question of historical assemblies and the use of the lot, is a project that looks at instances of collective governance throughout history and across the world, which is arguably a slightly overambitious way of stating what this project is all about. And I can talk a little bit about the limit and the boundaries of this in the Q&A if people are interested. But the reasons why we're doing this are twofold. First, again, if we sort of like believe the standard story of collective governance and the European evidence that we have for it, I think it is fair to say the theories that we build on this evidence are limited, are partial. And so what we want to do with this evidence that I will describe in a moment is to sort of like broaden our theories of collective governance. But the theory and the social science is not the whole story. With a bunch of collaborators, we're also trying to turn this data set into a tool that people, the communities online and offline can actually use to build more resilient self-governing practices today. And of course, part of the sort of like me being here, I guess, today, is that this data set, among other things, can be used to take a look at, for example, particular mechanisms, such as lotteries. So I'm going to be doing that today. But before we get there, I want to spend a little bit of time describing the database, without which I think it'd be hard to get the context, and give you some preliminary findings from the 2 years of data collection that we have conducted so far. I'll spend a little bit of time describing what we know about the use of the lot, which is indeed, spoiler alert, not so much. And then I'm going to try to give you a bit of context on how historical assemblies actually got things done, including, but also beside the use of the law. And then Ali sort of like provoked me a bit for this last bit to give you a sense of like how I use or how I imagine this evidence, this historical evidence might be used in the process of actually thinking about institution building today. So after a lot of talking about history, we're going to get to the meat at the very end. So please stay awake for that. It's going to be great. Okay, so I'm going to be describing for a few minutes what the database looks like, and this is sort of like going to include some definitions. So 2 years of data collection, we've got 66 communities, not a lot, guys, but this is what we've got. The communities that enter the data set are communities that meet at least one criterion, not necessarily one criterion, that they have one collective governance institution. That is an institution within which a group of more than one person makes decisions on behalf of a community. The crucial criterion for what defines a collective governance institution is drawn from the work of David Savage. This is for the sort of the dorks in the room that are like really into the social science behind this. If you don't know who David Savage is, it doesn't matter. The idea here is what I suppose that many of you who are scholars will, but the bottom line is that the idea is that participants in these collective governance institutions need to be independent of a higher authority if it exists. And so this is the basic criterion discriminating between early democracy and early autocracy in David's work, for those of you who know what I'm talking about. So 66 communities within, yes, please, Dimitri.
Quick clarifying question. What is higher authority here? What are we referring to? The principal or?
Yeah, this would be a higher authority understood like a king or an emperor or even like a higher governor. Right? And so the idea here is that if the line of command is one of dependency, you're responding to, you're essentially like implementing rules that come up from a higher authority, that doesn't really meet the basic requirement.
So voters would not be an example of higher authority?
No, that would not be the case. So within each community, there are a number of institutions, some of which are institutions for collective governance, some are not. And so we're looking actually at the nesting of collective governance practices within larger structures. And each institution has what we call mechanisms. And the mechanisms are really the nitty-gritty of how people got things done within the institutions. The actual rules, lotteries, elections, the various types of sort of tools that we then further classified or categorized in mechanisms that define access to the institutions, mechanisms that define decision-making practices, and mechanisms that regulate enforcement practices. Okay? So this is just to give you an overview of what we've got in the data set. We have got coverage of all regions of the world, except that, of course, the evidence from Europe is preponderant. This is I doubt that this is ever going to go away, but this is definitely a product of what kind of evidence is easily accessible, but essentially by a bunch of undergrads at King's College London, which is a bunch of evidence from Europe. We are now changing dramatically the way in which we conduct the data collection, which is going to bring us in contact with communities in various parts of the world that are not Western Europe and North America. And I can talk a little bit about that second stage in the Q&A if anyone is interested. But for the time being, what matters here is that what we're trying to do here is actually, again, shift the focus of attention beyond Europe and to try to understand what collective governance looks like in other places of the world. When we look at the communities by size, we see this, again, like relatively broad coverage, but a significant cluster around 10,000, the size that includes memberships between 10,000 and 100,000 participants. So not large, but also not tiny in historical perspective. And when you look at the time, we see a clustering of communities in the first millennium BC and in the second millennium AD. This, again, I doubt is an actual empirical result of the analysis, and it's mostly driven by the kind of evidence that we have at our disposal that covers the usual suspects from the largely European tradition. So we will see if by looking at other non-European cases, the timeline shifts with the evidence. I just wanted to give you a sense of like what these mechanisms look like. So of course, this matters to you because it includes the lotteries as a mechanism. I will talk about this in a moment, of access as a fundamental, is one of the primary, perhaps, mechanism for accessing collective governance institutions. But as you can see, there are a number of other mechanisms that come up in this data set that suggest variation across selection mechanisms. We see when we look at decision-making mechanisms, again, a preponderance of usual suspects such as councils and assemblies, but we also see the growing importance of things like deliberation, consensus, and representation. And when we look at enforcement, again, we see courts and tribunals as the primary bodies for enforcement procedures, but also some interesting evidence on the use of scrutinies and practices like ostracism and judicial review. So this is just to give you a sense of what is in this data set. So as I said, we have spent a couple of years collecting evidence. Again, a bunch of this evidence is from Europe. We're trying to push that, push against that, but we are not quite there yet. We have spent a good chunk of our summer, this past summer, looking at exactly what this database is telling us about collective governance. And so I'm just going to be mentioning 3 results, which I think are perhaps like promising enough that I still think that this work should be continued. I should continue to do this, but maybe this is something that you can advise me on towards the end of this presentation if you think that this is, there's no there. So the primary finding that seems of relevance is that the mechanisms that we see operating within collective governance communities that are in Europe are not the same as the mechanisms that we see otherwise in other places of the world. So that is quite interesting. This is just to give you a sense of what this looks like in the correlations. There is a cluster of mechanisms that we associate with collective governance today in the United States. We tend to think about collective governance as something that has assemblies, as we've heard today, councils, and things like lotteries, term limits, rotation. These mechanisms are very familiar to the Western tradition of collective governance. But it turns out that when we look outside of Europe, these mechanisms cease to be present, just simply. And when we see correlations between collective governance outside of Europe and particular mechanisms, we see something else popping up, essentially. These include informal sanctions, consultation procedures, popularity, meritocracy, and local councils, and blood relations and meritocracy. And again, like there is not just variation between Europe and other parts of the world, but also within non-European locations, we see variation as well. And so this is really, for us, a an indication that we should perhaps continue with the data collection in these other places and try to figure out what kind of picture we get of collective governance when we take a more global perspective on it. A couple of more, perhaps less interesting and a little bit boring findings, but please bear with me. There seems to be an inverted U-shaped relationship between size and duration. This is quite interesting because it seems to push against the idea that collective governance collapses at scale. It seems what we find in the data set so far is that there is a a sweet spot where collective governance communities seem to last longer. Again, lasting longer is not necessarily a sign of success. This is problematic, but this is what the data says so far. So we there seems to be like some illustrative evidence that suggests that there is something more interesting about scale and collective governance than what we tend to imagine, which is essentially that as scale increases, the probability of collective governance decreases. The third finding that I wanted to talk about is, again, variation by size. So this is a similar, perhaps, result, and it again suggests that there is something going on at the level of different communities of different sizes seem to be operating through different mechanisms. So again, this is perhaps something to keep in mind as we think about building collective governance spaces. It seems from the evidence that we've got that different mechanisms, like a mechanism might not apply equally to communities of various sizes. And here, when we look at sort of like mechanisms with European cases, we see this clustering of a series of mechanisms at a particular sort of this middle range sizes. When we take Europe out, we see more variation across sizes. And again, this is in part the problem here is that we don't have a lot of evidence, as I mentioned, about non-European cases. We certainly don't have as robust evidence about non-European cases, but these results are sort of like illustrative of something that is going on in sort of like different parts of the world that might tell us something new about collective governance. Let me just stop for a second before I get into the more meaty part to make sure that A, you have not fallen asleep, B, you're still with me and I have not jumped over massive logical steps. Good, excellent. Okay, so because this conference is about the lot and assemblies, Ali asked me to please sort of like reveal some information about what this data set says about this particular topic. And it turns out that, again, I'm very happy to be contradicted here by other people that are looking at lotteries more specifically. But what emerges in this particular case of collective governance communities or communities operating or building collective governance spaces is that the lot is not very common. And so I'm going to try to sort of articulate why that might be the case and where the lot is common, how it was used. And this is going to echo some of the comments that Ali has already made. And then I'm going to try to articulate what else is going on in historical assemblies in terms of these access and selection mechanisms that seems to be more prominent. So again, this is when we talk about lotteries, it is in historical practice, it is worth distinguishing between various uses of the lot. So we might think about the lot as a system to allocate resources. Ali has an excellent paper on land lotteries, for example. This is not what I'm looking at. The lotteries that I'm looking at here are uniquely systems for access to institutions. So they're a system of selection of members of an institution. And from the evidence that we have collected so far, the lot is really not that common. And it only applies to 3 cases, the third of which is, I believe, a coding mistake by one of my RAs, and it's the only one that is not in Europe. And so sort of like what the database is not a representative sample or what is the word that I'm looking for? Like comprehensive view of historical collective governance, but the evidence that we have so far really suggests that the lot is infrequent and fundamentally European. Within Europe, it was used in a variety of different ways. So this again echoes something that Ali has already said. It is used within the political process in very different ways, and even within each community, it can be used in different ways. So I'm giving you two examples of that. The first comes from Venice, Costas.
Can I curiosity question? Do I introduce myself again or it's totally your call? It's Costas Manatos from Kings. Curiosity question. Would you say, or would it be a plausible assumption to say that you see these lotteries in Venice or in Greek polis just because you can assure higher degree of preference homogeneity there, so then they would be more easy with accepting a lottery, as opposed to other more heterogeneous contexts?
Great, that is possible. I don't know. I don't think that the data set at this stage can allow me to reach conclusions, partly because, again, this is a very small sample. It is, the n is equals to 1.
Even anecdotally or like descriptively or like...
Yeah, and again, like, I can talk about ancient Athens until your eyes pop out, which I'm not going to do today, but it is certainly true that I think in the case of Athens in particular, compared to like the... I don't want to be historical here because Athens is a complicated part of the world, because if you think about Athens in terms of what we expect today representation or inclusion to be, of course Athens was elitist. This is something that Ali mentioned earlier, except that the comparison to Athens was Persia, where no one was participating to begin with. So again, it depends really on where you're standing. And so preference homogeneity in Athens is something that really is in the eyes of the beholder. So it changes depending on who you ask. If you ask sort of like a modern commentator, of course the Athenians were extremely homogeneous in terms of preferences. If you're thinking, however, in the historical context, particularly given heterogeneity in terms of like associational life, occupation, socioeconomic status, political views, think about Plato, that to me is evidence of preference heterogeneity. So again, I think this is a great question, but not something that I'm sure this data set could thoroughly address. Kevin, you have a burning?
Sure, yeah. So just on the preference homogeneity point, one thing maybe you could, if you look at places of similar size, right?
Yeah.
That might give you some kind of very rough indication of it, but you could also look at the contemporary justifications of the institution, right? So is it that we have lottery because we all think we are equally, we all have roughly the same views, and so it really doesn't matter who occupies the office? In Athens, that doesn't seem to be the case. It's more about equality. We are all sort of we respect everyone equally. Everyone who would like to have a place and speak and so forth is, yeah.
Because if everybody has the same, so you're right, but risk aversion might non-monotonically vary, because if I know everybody has the same preference, I'm willing to take the risk. Lottery. If I know everybody has very diverse preferences, it's better to the lottery. It's only in the midpoint that I would be willing to switch from a lottery to something that I could potentially control more, or I could, like, in a situation where I'm 86, 70% more strong and I can just think I have full control of the power. If we're too diverse or too homogeneous, then the risk aversion relationship with that might not be monotonic. I mean, that's a hypothesis, right? Not.
Are you settled with your own questions? Okay, let me just continue. So again, like, I don't think, looking at the justification for the lot is going to be rife with problems of what is the evidentiary basis that's justifying that use. Looking at size might be interesting, but again, like, the N is so small that it's going to be essentially like non-informative. But this is, again, like, if data collection processes in the future will change this picture, I think that those questions will become more relevant. So again, just going back to these two examples, which I think are pretty illustrative of the range of uses of the lot in historical societies, although, of course, these are perhaps some of the most well-known cases. Just to give you a brief sort of like a comparison between a situation in which the lot was really folded into an extremely complex procedure, but at a very high stakes in the political process. So the Doge is the highest authority in Venice between the 11th and the 14th century, and the selection of the Doge was entrusted, as Greif and Leighton summarize in this passage here, to a committee which was itself selected by a combination of lot and delegation. And the process was, well, like, famously extraordinarily complicated, involving 9 steps. And so again, we see the lot, and this is perhaps a point that is relevant also for some of the questions in the roundtable later. The lot here is not just a sort of like a unique system of selection that is presented as better or worse, or for particular reasons, depending on the particular sort of like needs of the society, but it is really part of a much more complex system of selection that is aimed at a variety of outcomes, including some of the outcomes that Ali has discussed, particularly the sort of like attempt at eliminating elite capture by, in this case, clans and social groups within the polity of Venice. In Athens, the law was used much more broadly. In fact, the 3 of the 4 main institutions included the use of the law one way or another. The fourth being the assembly, that was where members were selected on a first come, first served basis. But in looking at the other 3 main institutions in the polity of Athens, we see that again, like, the law was used abundantly and differentially. In the council that I will talk about more in a second, it was used for the selection of a representative sample of jurors. In the courts, it was very interestingly, again, for the dorks in the room, well known to be used on a daily basis for the selection of jury panels in the law courts through the system known as Clariterion. This is the part where like I sort of flash you this like ancient system of randomization that the Athenians used, and in the council again it was used in a slightly different way that I will talk about in greater depth in a moment. Sorry, and with the magistrates, it was also used for the selection of some magistrates, but not all. So again, within each institutions, we see a number of potentially different selection processes and variation across them as well. So this is the part where the slides were sort of like messed up. So I wanted to just suggest, let's see. Okay, so the point here is that the lot is not very commonly used based on my data collection among historical cases of historical communities practicing form of collective governance. So what else is used, let's say, in historical assemblies? And this, again, just to give you a sense of what I mean by historical assemblies, we coded a variety of them. Assemblies that operate at the central level, which means the highest administrative level within a community, and assemblies that operate at the local level, so sort of like a subunits within a community. And we coded both at the local and the central level assemblies that featured some sort of like an elite a membership, or just a broader citizen assembly of the kinds that we are discussing today. Assemblies, again, this reflects some of the stuff that I've already discussed, are by and large a European and a little bit Asian as well phenomenon, and they are overwhelmingly in the data set central and citizen-based, not elite. Okay, so this is just to give you a sense of what else is going on. The lot appears so high up in this matrix, largely because it is used so frequently in Athens and in other Greek polis. So this is actually a somewhat of a false result, because what's driving the frequency here is really the sort of multiple uses that particularly Greek polis made of the lottery, of lotteries. What else is going on in terms of access mechanisms in global historical collective governance are the use of elections, the use of age boundaries, and the use of blood relations and property requirements. So if we look at global history, elections certainly play a fundamental role, but the other systems of selecting into assemblies, again, by and large, central, non-elite assemblies are systems that we actually associate with more oligarchical, perhaps, structures today. Okay. All right, everyone still with me? All right, you're still nodding, which is amazing. I really appreciate it. Okay, how am I on time? Ali?
You're good. You have 17 more minutes.
17?
17, but that includes...
Oh, okay. Oh, okay, so I have 2. Okay, so I'm going to actually go quickly through this. And this is just this is something that I spend a lot of time on, which is like, okay, let's say that I do these things because I'm a classical historian by training, which is only part of the reason, arguably. And I study historical collective governance because, again, this is what a historian, someone trained as a historian does. I actually think that there's a little bit more to it than that, and I think that this evidence is actually fundamental to understand how to build institutions today, particularly at a time when sort of like Western liberalism seems to have to be at the point of like descendants as opposed to like ascendants. But the question of like how to actually use this evidence to build institutions today is, to me, not that obvious. And so some of us have been spending a little bit of time trying to write about it and trying to think about it. My colleague Nathan Snyder and David Sasavage at NYU, whom I mentioned earlier, wrote this like very nice short piece in Noema where they suggest how lessons from early democracies or historical collective governance communities can be used to think about platform regulation. And a couple of years ago, I wrote a sort of a provocative, perhaps, piece in Wired that was sort of like meant to use the example of the Athenian Council to think about algorithmic accountability. So I tend to never mention that piece to anyone, but Ali knows about it, and she asked me to talk about it. So it's her fault. essentially.
What did you say in the piece, Federica?
Oh, look, let me tell you all about it. So this, again, the sort of like the provocation came from my involvement in an OpenAI report that came out in 2020, which for questions of algorithm accountability, this is equivalent to ancient history. The report was on trustworthy AI, and the report essentially sort of like summarized the question of like how to build institutions for algorithmic accountability that actually included some sort of like accountability to the companies with the words like we should create external auditing bodies, but of course the report never sort of like mentioned what those auditing bodies ought to look like. And so the piece was meant to sort of like provoke people into thinking about how to use historical evidence for thinking about this kinds of institution building in ungoverned spaces, perhaps. Still ungoverned, certainly, in the US. So again, the premises of the piece were the sort of like just provoke readers into thinking about the fundamental clash between the use of algorithms in society and thinking about democracies and assemblies. In one case, you get sort of an optimization function that tells you this is the best possible outcome. But of course, this is not something that will surprise many of you in the room. This is not how politics works. And in fact, based on what we might describe as the original lesson of democracy, these types of societal trade-offs are best addressed by listening to varied voices, by many voices. And so the piece was sort of like, again, trying to look at empirical evidence of how large-scale citizen governance on tough questions might occur. And so the provocation was to model a idealized institution for algorithmic accountability on the Athenian Council of 500. And here the devil's in the details, right? I don't want to sort of bore you too much with this, but the idea here is that the bulle featured very few, very interesting rules that in a sort of like a nice little package ensured broad citizen participation and representation. So let me address some of the questions that Ali got, because the Athenians seem to have sort of like a thought about stratification in a slightly different way, which is essentially over time. And so they used a lot to select people across relevant cleavages. We can talk about that again until your eyes pop out, but let me not bore you too much. They had an annual mandate, so you're in and then you're out. The mandate cannot be iterated. It cannot be iterated consecutively, and in general, you cannot iterate the mandate for more than 2 years. The result of this, some classical historians have done the numbers, is that a huge chunk of the Athenian the part of the population that was eligible for participation in politics, a huge chunk of that population actually at one point in their lives participated in this institution. And that had some really interesting sort of like knock-on effects. The knock-on effects are that these rules enabled this particular institution to enable to avoid some of the pitfalls that we normally associate with collective governance, such as the possibility of elite capture, but also the idea that collective governance is just a bunch of ignorant people, in the Athenian case, sitting on a hill, making decisions about things that they don't know anything, and therefore that's why they need experts. And the Athenians seem to have sort of like overcome this problem through the system of rules that promoted knowledge aggregation within the institution at a given time and learning over time. So again, I don't want to sort of like spend more than I have already spent in terms of time, sort of like trying to convince you that there is something valuable thinking about these historical institutions for institution building today. But I hope to have given you a sense that it is, in fact, sort of like perhaps about time to think about experiments in collective governance that are both past and global, to think about systems of collective governance that go beyond this sort of like a real interesting, but also peculiar in my perspective, sort of a focus on the lot, and also to think very, very clearly and sort of like a clear-eyedly, perhaps, about application of this evidence to modern institution building. I'm going to shut up. Thank you for your consideration. Some of you are still awake, I think. Ali.
Hi, I'm Ali Cerrone. You've heard me talk a lot. So one thing I think that's interesting about this research is one, scale. So a lot of the people in this room are trying to figure out, can we scale,
Right.
not just governance, but, different type of scale, but to what extent, can deliberative groups be bigger? Can we have multiple of them running? Can we start doing thousands of people in assemblies? So what does your research teach us about scale? And this kind of goes back to Costa's question. It's interesting because we see historically a lot of the cool stuff with lotteries happened in Europe. Right, but these were also the first democracies. They were also easier to govern. They were richer. There's a lot of other correlates that might kind of explain this. But it is the case that even today, so in the U.S., we have a lot of people in this room that are doing U.S.-based activities. But Europe is by far surpassing us in terms of the experimentation, the novelty, and having this be routine. So people know about citizens' assemblies in Europe. The average American citizen, I would argue, does not. And so, is there a European magic? Is this kind of path dependence? Is there something? Do you think that the European way can be exported?
So about scale, I think that this is in fact one of the biggest takeaway from this research is to push against the idea that there is something about a small scale that favors collective governance and something about large scale that makes it impossible. And I think that the devil's in the details here. I'm not going to say that that fundamental assumption about the what makes collective governance flourish is falsified by what I'm seeing. What I'm seeing is in fact that collective governance institutions occur at any scale in a polity, from very, very small to pretty large. And what seems to be particularly relevant is the ways in which they are nested within other institutions. And so I think that this is in fact something that the database can really give us, because we are not going to have a Congress of lottery elected participants. And so I think that the question for us is not so much to think about substitution, but to think about ways in which we can integrate systems of collective governance within other hierarchical, representative, and various types of institutions. So scale to me is a red herring per se, but the real question is about articulation of various types of institutions with potentially very different mechanisms of selection of decision making and so on and so forth. And again, I don't think that we're going to get much past that almost already ideal version of doing politics. I think that participation has a role to play, but not everywhere, perhaps. And this is, again, the social science that we need is really about these questions. So that's about scale. On Europe, I think that Europe has, that's interesting. I don't know, but the answer to your question is I don't know. But I think that Europe has a long-term tradition of types and forms of collective governance. It also has, of course, for a variety of reasons, political fragmentation is something that political scientists love to think about all the time, a more ease with less hierarchical forms of governance. I don't think that the United States is in a particularly different position, and I think that there's actually quite a bit of experimentation in the US. It's just the US is so much bigger. And I think that it's also probably true that I wonder if that is correct. What are the expectations of the average European citizen versus the average American citizen? I think that they change also dramatically. So I'm not quite sure that it is true that the average European citizen knows about citizen assemblies in the way that. But I don't know. This is my complete speculation. I think that there is something historical about that favored the historical creation of collective governance in Europe. But again, I think that there is a lot of evidence that suggests that collective governance is not just a European phenomenon. We're just not looking at it. And so again, the project here goes into the quite thorny question of how to elicit that evidence, which is usually couched in accessible through much more hard to access processes, sometimes involving oral histories and interviews and so on and so forth. And that's where we're going, but that's going to be a can of worms, so to speak. Yes, Chris, I guess you're next.
Hi, my name is Chris. I'm with Meta, and really appreciated hearing more about your studies, and also really enjoyed your Wired article.
Thanks,
and really
Chris.
excited to talk more about that as well. I would just note that at Meta we are ahead of OpenAI in deliberative discourse. Just a friendly plug. But I guess as you talk about scaling, I think to follow up on the question on scaling, something that we're super interested in. I am curious, as you looked at data on deliberative discourse or mechanisms outside of Europe? You highlighted like some various kind of ways that people structured their deliberation. Understanding that there's a dearth of data or just less data or less examples, I guess I'm just wondering, do you think, is it from a scaling perspective, does there need to be a difference in selection, or do you also think in terms of the structure of the deliberation, again, understanding that there's not as much data, but like, is there, as scaling moves towards more inclusion in the global South in particular, does there need to be an adjustment in the actual model of deliberation?
Yeah, so this is I think where this result is most interesting. This is it. So the idea that there are different mechanisms. In a best case scenario, what this on the y-axis you would have mechanisms here, and so what you're seeing here is in fact the mechanisms that operate in differently sized communities. The data here is too terrible to draw any conclusion, really, and it would be like sort of like a little bit absurd for me to tell you things that I can't really say. But what this result tells us is that it is precisely this kind of question that we should ask. This is clearly indicating that for the communities that we have in the data set, different mechanisms of access, of decision-making, I'll get to deliberation in a second, but selection, decision-making, enforcement of decisions vary across size groups. And so that might be, that will be one of the things that we try to investigate further. Just to be clear, we don't really we have deliberation is one of the decision-making mechanisms, but it is not by far the only one. So it is one of about 100 mechanisms.
Thanks. I wonder, so, one of the things about having clustering of decision-making processes or collective governance institutions is it raises questions about diffusion, right? So, it's not just Athens, right? It's a whole bunch of Greek polises, polis, whatever. And so I wonder to what extent the data set as it exists now, or as you plan to make it, would tell us about diffusion networks. What can we infer about this stuff? So it's very interesting how, we have a whole, 1,000 years without lots in Europe, and then it pops up in Venice, and I'm sure, given the way that these types of things work, people are talking about and thinking about Greece in Venice.
Yeah.
And likewise today, when people talk about, in rooms like this, when people talk about lotteries, they point back to Athens. So I wonder what you have to...
Yeah, no, this is a great question, and we are, the next thing that we're going to be doing is a clustering analysis that's going to tell us, in fact, if we have neighboring effects or clustering effects of this kind, particularly at the level of the region, or not, because that analysis should tell us if we do have this type of like a diffusion of institutions within a sort of like a geographic region or sub-region, like we see in Greece, for example. That is a very striking. In fact, it is so striking that as a classical historian, and so knowing pretty much what I'm doing in that particular context, I had to take the Greek polis and essentially squeeze them into two entries in the data set. I've got Athens, for which we have an enormous amount of evidence, and I've got Greek democracies, and then I've got Greek oligarchies. And if I were to code all of them, I would have 3,000 cases in Europe and nothing for any of the other regions. So those neighboring effects and clustering effects at the level of the region are already evident in this grouping, which, by the way, we're going to have to sort of like disaggregate in some way. But what we're trying to do now is actually trying to sort of like be agnostic about the existence of those clusters and run a clustering analysis and see whether in fact it is regional diffusion or something else entirely that is driving similarity across communities. Thank you, that's great.
With that, we're actually out of time.
Okay, great, thank you.